This is Rudkowski of WeAreChange.org here at day 3 in Bilderberg in Turin, Italy. And today I am joined by my good friend Charlie Skelton, which I believe is one of the best researchers and specifically writers when it comes to the topic of Bilderberg. You might have seen his work in Newsweek, The Guardian, and many other publications. And I really believe you do really good work when it comes to connecting the dots and not going off conspiracy theories. And one thing that I really wanted to talk to you about is that this meeting is very different than other meetings, especially when we're seeing a very large contingent from a lot of Eastern European countries. James Baker is here, which is very important, especially with his significance here. But we're seeing representatives from Poland, which we have seen before, but now this year, Estonia, Serbia, Turkey, Latvia. We also have a representative here from the Munich Security Council, and of course, a lot of figures who are anti-Russia. Vladimir Putin, interestingly, during the first day of this conference, publicly announced that warning people about World War III and how it would lead to the end of civilizations. And if there ever was a meeting that would potentially start a war, or even discuss it, or even plan it, the Bilderberg Group meeting would be it, especially with all the other meetings that are happening. It seems like almost like at this time right now, all the world leaders are meeting. We have the NATO defense meeting happening right now. We have the G7 happening right now. And also the Russian-China security meetings are happening right now, where they're going to be representatives of Iran and Pakistan also represented in that country again. So we're seeing all these meetings happen at once. And it really, with the banksters, with the media, with the big oil companies, what else do you really need to kind of peripherate this kind of bigger conflict that has been obviously geopolitically in the mix between Russia and the Western powers for a very long time, especially with people like James Baker. Sorry for my tirade, but important facts and details to bring up. Can you tell us about James Baker?
Yeah, well, he seems an interesting chap. He's sort of in charge of kind of Pentagon wargaming. He's kind of like the actuary who says, well, if we do X, they'll do Y. We might win this if we do that. So he's kind of, the US is kind of chief of kind of strategic planning in a way. In his past, he had a job. He was strategy advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, specifically with looking at geopolitical change. So it's all about the balance of power, and I think that's what comes out from this year. It's all about the balance of power. And Kissinger's been talking about this for decades. As usual, he has his kind of eagle-eye view on world events, and he was saying 14, 15 years ago that there's going to be a pivot to China, and I think that's kind of being strategized and discussed at this year's Bilderberg. There's a lot of kind of military strategy wonks here.
Yeah, Trump's National Security Council member is also here, and he specifically deals with China and could tell, and his specific field is understanding how China would respond if there possibly was a war or a bigger kind of geopolitical move made here. But from all the previous events and coming up to this one, what do you see kind of the overall thesis of Bilderberg with these meetings, especially with the crowd that we have here, and what potentially they may be kind of discussing or colluding together with?
Well, I mean, that's tricky. I would say that one of the things that we're just talking about, military planning and strategy, one of the things that seems to be key at this Bilderberg and more generally is AI. So you've got people like Michael C. Horowitz, who's from Council on Foreign Relations. He's an academic, but his main interest is in military innovation and AI. And he talks a lot about how AI is going to be kind of disruptive to the balance of power, how it's going to play out, and how that's going to, particularly with China being outspending the US in AI and in terms of the military and generally, how that's going to play out in terms of this kind of pivot to China and the world power. So I think there's a kind of it's a kind of unease in a way at Bilderberg, because this is the sort of transatlantic establishment talking and thinking. That includes industrialists, bankers, and the military, and intelligence. We've got the head of the French Foreign Intelligence Service here. There's lots of big people looking at the big picture. Clearly they don't know what the big picture is, but what's interesting is you don't just have people who are interested in terms of politics and states, which you do have, and that's incredibly important, you know, the Secretary General of NATO and people like that. You also have people who are trying to make a buck. You know, there's people like KKR, you know, so Henry Kravis, and he's brought David Petraeus, you know, former CIA director, who now runs the KKR Global Institute. And KKR is a huge Wall Street player, investor, and they're just looking around the world and trying to work out, you know, how to make a buck. And, you know, that's just one of the many billionaire investors here. So it's a weird situation where you've got this strategizing going on, but you've also got people who are going, oh, and, you know, where do I put my coins now for the next 10 years? And whether they're bitcoins or actual coins, I don't know. And so, anyway, I find that fascinating. And so when people talk about it being a valuable meeting, and like Tony Blair always called it useful, and even you referred to, I think, when you confronted him. And a lot of people hear that word useful a lot, or valuable, again. And you sort of think, well, one person's valuable is not another person's. It might be valuable for some French minister or a Spanish deputy prime minister or whatever to get a kind of sense of what's going on in terms of their politics, but it's also valuable for some, you know, bank and, you know, some board member of Barclays or HSBC to kind of get ahead on what's happening in the world. So there's a kind of, you know, value is a strange term that can be read very differently.
Well, of course, knowledge is power, and I think the bigger aspect of that and the kind of bigger trend that we're seeing emerging from Bilderberg within the last few years is a larger contingent every year of, I would call them kind of technocrats. A lot of people from biometrics, a lot of tech companies, a lot of artificial intelligence companies, a lot of quantum computing companies. And I think this is extremely important because even the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, said the country that will first dominate the AI market will ultimately control the world. And we're talking about God-like powers and abilities that are far beyond human ability to even comprehend. So this is this like sci-fi stuff that we're talking about, but of course they're going to be ahead of the curve and understanding the larger implications as technology is becoming inevitable in our daily lives. And seeing it here definitely doesn't put a good feeling to it. I don't know about yourself.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, but a lot of these areas all kind of coalesce and come in together. So they all sort of cluster around AI. So whether it's biotech, you know, and the kind of enhanced technologies and sort of biometrics, everything, it's all here. All of these different, you know, there's even stem cell research here. So there's kind of, it's a broad palette of tech, but it all seems to come back to AI. And, you know, Bilderberg were very keen to, you know, evolve, clearly. They've done it pretty well. You know, for a group that was kind of a fusty old, you know, British American intelligence unit back in the kind of 50s, very sort of Cold War about that sort of balance of power. Now they're really just trying to keep up and doing their best. And then, so when they bring in their kind of intellectual buffet of experts, it's not just because it's interesting. They really are trying to not stay ahead a bit, but, you know, keep up with the Joneses. Yeah.
And of course benefit themselves ahead of the curve and not everyone else, because if you look at a lot of these people, whenever they do a philanthropic, sorry, I can't even say that word, act, whenever they do an act of kindness or donate some money, they buy the best PR to promote that. But here, a ton of secrecy, Chatham House rules, everything's off the record. There's a literal army that goes with them whenever they go off to a museum, like they did last night, where we were, again, interrogated and detained by the police there. But I talked to one of the members outside that you helped me identify, Dolphner, and he's like, no, nothing big, nothing evil's happening here, nothing sinister's happening here. And I'm like, fine, tell us what's going on then. And he's like, And there's historical precedents here that people need to understand, and significance here, because, I mean, this is the group that openly bragged about helping foment the European Union. The New York Times even wrote about how it was John Edwards' speech here at Bilderberg that got him the VP seat under John Kerry. As we know, Bill Clinton was here before he became president. Tony Blair was here before he became prime minister. Other people allude that Barack Obama was possibly here before becoming president of the United States. And obviously, a lot of these inner powers and a lot of these people, especially Kissinger, are interconnected with each other. But there's some significance to the people who are here, who are also next in kin, next in line to get the power, that are also interesting to see, like the governor of Colorado and the Cardinal of the Vatican. What have you seen from the list of attendees and the kind of next of kin kind of power situations?
Well, I'd like to go back first of all and mention Macron, because if you look at how Macron came to power, he came to Bilderberg, and he sort of came through the Institut Montaigne, a think tank in France, and the president of that is Henri de Castries, who runs the Bilderberg steering committee. And anyway, it's worth digging into, because you can see that was slightly, I mean, you might be overstretching it to say it was a Bilderberg operation to get Macron in power, but he certainly is one of their guys. And you can sort of see these clones of Macron now. There's a Spanish one, Albert Rivera, and there's a Greek one, and this kind of like smooth populist guy, slightly sort of right of centre, but still a bit liberal, but just very Bilderbergian. And another, there's a guy from Canada, Mr. Champagne, who's their international trade minister. And I just saw him arriving, and he was just such a smooth operator, shaking everyone's hand, smiling. He just oozed politics as he came through. And you can see that's their kind of model for the people they like to nerd. The kind of Blair was like that back in the day, before he just kind of melted into his own evil and just looks kind of mental now. But so there's plenty of these kinds of people there seem to be, in fact, quite a lot this year of these kind of up and comers.
There's a lot of dots to connect. There's a lot of coincidences, but just looking at the list, just looking at the agenda, I definitely do think that there's something big in play, and I think obviously Bilderberg has always had an anti-Russian stance, but I think this year they're wrapping it up, and I think there's definitely something big in the works, especially with all these meetings happening here. That's just my analysis of it. Any last words, any last kind of analysis on this year's Bilderberg meeting that you have?
Yeah, just something you pick up on something you mentioned that Matthias Döpfner said when you spoke to him. Like, he said, it's all innocent, and you're saying, well, then why not talk about it? I don't even care whether it's innocent or not. That isn't even for me the issue. It's a structural issue. It's a political structural issue in which you have so many politicians, 4 prime ministers, 2 deputy prime ministers, etc., 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 the Secretary General of NATO, all of these people and policymakers with so many, Wall Street billionaires and investors and bank bosses and Henry Kravises and that kind of thing. Tucked away for 3 days, which is far longer than anyone else's meeting, far longer. It's by far the longest kind of time that the Secretary General of NATO will spend at a meeting. Same applies to all of these prime ministers. So that, to me, is structurally problematic. And I don't care whether it's innocent or not what they're talking about. It just seems to be pulling the whole process away from any kind of democratic accountability, any kind of nod towards press oversight or transparency. And with that many politicians, so many senior politicians, that to me seems hugely problematic.
Yeah. It doesn't really seem innocent with the way that we're being treated outside and harassed and interrogated and stopped and detained almost everywhere you go, and how there's almost a literal army protecting and guarding these guys, and even going as far as like putting a gun into somebody's face, which they did. So,
I'd carefully, you're about to open a door where I just start emoting wildly, but the amount of trying to think of something that isn't a swear word. The amount of pressure and that gets put upon journalists, the very few journalists that come here to do this, when you compare it to the G7, when it's you've been there, yeah. It's like a holiday camp. It's a huge operation. They had so many journalists when we went. They had to house it in the Olympic ice skating stadium. It was vast. It had 4,000 odd journalists. There are 4,000 journalists right now at the G7 being fed and given like like memory sticks with footage on and press releases and being pampered. They probably got back rubs, I don't know. Do you remember they had those little sort of relaxy zones? You could put little masks on and sit down in little cushioned corners to relax because it's such hard work writing up press releases, right? That gets my goat in a massive way, that it's happening right now, and there's no journalists here apart from you guys and, like, I think a Russian TV crew, but like almost none. And and yet you look at the two meetings and go, well, I don't know why. I mean, why is Bloomberg not covering this? Bloomberg thinks it's at the centre of the global finance news, and there is two national bank governors, a deputy national bank governor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I had a hard choice. I was like, cover the G7 or cover this. If I covered the G7, I would literally they had $2,000 champagnes, they had massage rooms, they had the best accommodations, gifts, book bags, clothes, slippers, trinkets. They give you everything when you're at the press of the G7, like we saw a couple of years ago when we attended the G7. But it's more important to cover this meeting. This meeting, I believe, is more significant, and that's why we are out here. And we're mainly out here because of you and your viewership. There's not many independent journalists left, and you guys have to do your best to make sure that the message gets out and that we're supported, because if it's not for you, we wouldn't be here. I want to thank Charlie again for doing amazing, incredible work. He's working on another masterpiece on his laptop right now, so we're not going to go bother him. But the link to his Twitter account where you could see all his amazing snarky photos as well that we saw and great, amazing work on this conference will be in the description. I definitely think it's worth checking out. I love you guys. Thank you again so much for watching. Stay tuned for more.